All right, we're live. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Julia Campbell, your host. If you're listening to the recording on Nonprofit Nation, welcome to my podcast listeners. Welcome to everyone that's joined us on LinkedIn Live today. So today's a really timely episode. I'm actually really excited to dive into some of the concepts that we're going to talk about, how to take care of yourself while changing the world. So, in a world where burnout is the norm and rest is often seen as a luxury, and with these headlines whiplashing us every single day, how can we as change makers sustain our well-being while still making an impact? So, I'm joined by my friend Meico Marquette Whitlock, a workplace well-being strategist, mindfulness teacher, and recovering workaholic, who joins us to explore how we as mission-driven professionals can prioritize self-care and just, taking care of our emotions without guilt, and how we can create this culture in our organizations. So some of the things we're going to talk about today, reconnecting to your why, especially right now when the work and maybe the news feels overwhelming, how to create a sustainable culture of well-being at work, navigating social impact grief, processing the emotional weight of change making that we all feel. And then we're going to talk also maybe about digital well-being in a hyper-connected world. So, Meico, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. And
Yay.
I suspect this is going to be a juicy conversation. So if we need to go long, I'm happy
Yes,
to do that. So you
yes.
let me know what the audience wants and we can just stay as long as we need to.
Yes, and everyone, please do add your comments, add your feedback. We'd love to hear from you. Maybe as Meico goes through the strategies, like how are you navigating this moment? How are you, investing in self care, or self care is such a broad term. Like, what does it mean to you?
Mhm.
So I wanted to establish, sort of the reason that I wanted to do this LinkedIn Live and release this podcast immediately. There's so much going on specifically in the nonprofit sector right now.
Yes.
So, just a little context of things I've been thinking about and really kind of stressing over. So, we know that in January, the Office of Management and Budget issued a memorandum directing a temporary pause on all federal financial assistance, including grants to NGOs. And this affected approximately 10,000 organizations and really disrupted funding for various programs. But the recent suspension of federal grants by this administration, it extends beyond just the USAID funded programs, and it really affects a wide array of nonprofits across various sectors. It really affects like domestic programs, housing, domestic violence prevention, critical services, and the sector. We're coming off COVID still, and this has led for a lot of us like real uncertainty around programs, around employment, job losses, operations. And there's another prong to all of this stress. Should we well, I know my answer to this. Should we take wording that the administration might find questionable, like around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? Should we take it off our website? What should we do about serving our clients, especially if they're impacted by some of the executive orders? There's so much swirling around. And what I love, Meico, about your work is that you put things into frameworks and terms that we can
Yes.
easily digest and understand. And so I want to start off, so many of us are experiencing what you call social impact grief, which is the emotional toll, as I understand it, of fighting for change in a world that often resists it. And that
Yeah.
really struck with me. I feel like I've been fighting that since the 90s.
Yeah.
So how can we process and navigate that grief in a
Yeah.
productive, like a healthy way?
Yeah. So just taking a step back and
Yeah.
unpacking this idea of social impact grief. So there is what many of us are familiar with, which is, I guess, individual grief, right? Or maybe the individual experience of grief, where maybe we're grieving the loss of a loved one, we're grieving the loss of a pet, for example. It's something that's very tangible, and we have a normalized way of thinking about it, right? So if you say,
Like the
"Oh,
seven
like my,"
stages or something.
exactly, and you say like, "If my dog died or my mom transitioned," people understand, and we have sort of in our culture, we have a way of sort of socializing people around that.
Mhm.
Social impact grief falls into the bucket of what experts call collective grief. And so I call it social impact grief in the sub bucket of collective grief, where we are collectively having this experience of grief together, in part because the nature of the work that we do as mission driven folks is a bit different in terms of how we approach work, right? We lead with our hearts, right? We give everything that we have to the missions. For many of us, it's deeply personal why we do the work that we do. And so when we see what's happening in the world right now, and to your point, doing this work in the world that sometimes seems to resist it, there is what experts call sort of a form of ambiguous loss, right? Where it's intangible, right? You're feeling things, you're thinking things, the things that are sort of showing up in your body in terms of how the grief shows up and how we process it. But we don't have necessarily language or framing around it, right? And so sometimes it can feel like we're being gaslit, right? Maybe we're not sure that what we're experiencing is valid. So the first place that I want to start is by simply acknowledging that what you are experiencing is normal, right? It's a natural response to loss of any kind, whether that is the loss of a loved one, something that's more tangible, or whether it's a non-death loss or an ambiguous loss, like what we're talking about with social impact grief, where we're grieving the loss of progress that we have been fighting generations to make, right? And it feels like it's being undone before our eyes. We're grieving the loss of a future that we may never have, that we thought we were going to have, or that our children may never have, that we always dreamed for them, right? And there might not be closure to this type of loss, right? And so that's another aspect of it that makes it particularly challenging. And so the first place that I start with this is, again, normalizing and simply acknowledging however you're feeling, however you're expressing right now in this moment is perfectly okay. And we also get to acknowledge the hard truth that, the Lion King reminds us is part of the circle of life, right? Loss, disappointment, death, all of these things are a natural part of life. And part of the hope that we have is that because of that, we're actually built to be resilient. We're actually built to be able to navigate these kinds of losses, right? That doesn't mean it's going to be easy, right? That doesn't mean that we're going to wave a magic wand and have everything be okay right now. But we have history, right? We have ancestors that have come before us that have fought long and hard, that have navigated, that have cultivated resilience. We have models in that. And we have, again, going back to the circle of life, this is a natural part of it. And we have the ability within us to be able to navigate this. So I can walk people through a framework for this, but I just want to pause and see if you have anything that you want to share in response to what I've already put out there.
Well, you can see it's really resonating with people. So Tracy says, love the framing of social impact grief. Carol says, thank you for naming what I've been feeling for years. And that's how I felt when I read it. And Not Tree says, I love that connection, circle of life. So I think it's so interesting because we, like you said, just to reiterate what you said, we feel like we understand grief. Obviously, I don't understand someone else's grief personally, but I understand there are the 7 stages, or I understand like it's normal to feel this way when you grieve the loss of a person, you grieve the loss of a job, you grieve the loss of a pet, you grieve the loss of something tangible. But the social impact grief is lingering. And like you said, there's not necessarily going to be closure. It could just like death by 1,000 cuts almost sometimes. So so now you can go into the framework. Like, how do we navigate that?
Yes. So as we get into this framework, I want to also share, because you mentioned the stages of grief. So many of us are familiar with like the typical stages of grief, like anger, denial, and so on, right? Acceptance, bargaining. Those stages of grief are, I think many of us have taken them to be sort of the only forms of grief, or the only sort of phases of grief, if you will. And we've taken them to mean that it's a linear process. And that's not actually the case. So the person who defined these stages, the intention wasn't to say these are the only ways that the grief shows up, or that these are sort of the steps you follow. It's sort of it was an attempt to really describe sort of commonalities in our grief experience, right? And so this is important because there isn't a prescribed timeline for how you grieve. There isn't a right or wrong way for how you express, right? There isn't a prescribed linear process where you have to go from bargaining to acceptance. Like, that's not how grief works. So for many of us, it's very messy, and it's less of sort of a linear line from one step to the next. To one day you're feeling okay, to the next moment something triggers you and you're in tears, right? Or you're going into a funk, right? So it looks differently for each of us. And I think what we get to do is we get to acknowledge that and to honor that, which actually brings me to the first part of this framework. So the framework is called ACE, ACE, and ACE stands for acknowledge, confront, and execute, right? So the A, acknowledgement, is simply about acknowledging the truth about where you are in the grieving process. Again, there's no right or wrong way. There's no timeline. There's no prescribed order of steps. And simply just acknowledging where you are. And there's some practical ways that you can do this. For some people, maybe it's through journaling. Maybe it's through talking out loud with a friend, therapy, support groups. Maybe there are mindfulness practices. Again, this is another place where there isn't a right or wrong way to do this. But it's simply, without judging yourself or someone else, without even trying to change anything or take action, you're simply acknowledging where you are in your grief journey, right? And so, Julia, you've already done that, right? And I think there was a Tracy in the chat that talked about feeling this way for many, many years, right?
Yeah.
That is simply stating that, right? Simply writing that is doing this first part of this process, which is acknowledgement, right? The second step, the C, is about confrontation or confronting. And it's about really saying, okay, well, yes, I'm grieving. Here's the step I'm at. Here's the stage I'm at right now in this moment in this grieving process. And what do I need right now, right? What resources or people do I have to support me right now? What's in my control to do despite how I'm feeling right now in this moment? And so one of the important things about this is that our thoughts and our feelings, the sensations that we have in our body, which is how grief sort of manifests and shows up, right, for us, those things don't necessarily go away on their own before you can begin to take action, right? You can begin to take action. You can begin to move onward with life, even as you are holding space for the feelings and the thoughts and the very real raw emotions that you're holding on to. So this final step, the E, the execution, this is about taking constructive action, right? And so in the workplace context, when we talk about collective grief, this might mean acknowledging where you are, acknowledging that you have resources and support, and then going that step further to actually reach out to HR and say, hey, what's the latest on our mental health benefits, right? Do we have grief counseling available through our EAP program? Is there a support group through an ERG or an employee resource group that we have? Do I have access to a spiritual community, for example? Do I have access to be a part of a community like what we're creating right now, sort of in the moment, to be able to just simply share, hey, I have this same experience, right? I am not alone in this, right? Part of our experience sometimes is exacerbated because we feel like we are alone, right? And that's not the truth, right? The truth is that we are resourced, that we are in a community, that we're doing this together, and we get to acknowledge the sort of the beautiful struggle of being in pain, but also working together to figure out how do we transmute or transform that pain into something beautiful.
I love that. And I actually read about this framework. You posted, and I posted it into the chat, a blog on year-end anxiety. I felt that so deeply in my bones. I think the framework's applicable to any time you're feeling anxiety or stress.
Yes.
But that year-end anxiety that I think, you and I as entrepreneurs and being self-employed feel like we're not doing enough. We didn't close out the year strong enough. But nonprofits have so much pressure at year-end, especially, that I think having a framework like this to really, process and work through what you're going through. I just think right now there's so much. There's always so much uncertainty, but right now, I think, especially if people are working on issues that are in the news, right? So many of us feel overwhelmed by the urgency of the work.
Yes.
And I feel like we're getting very burned out. And how
Yes.
can we reconnect to our why
Yeah.
in ways that don't burn us out?
So the first thing I will say is that, just wrapping up this point about
Yes.
the ACE framework as we transition into talking about your why, it's an ongoing process, right? The circle of life is not really a circle, it's a
No.
spiral.
And it's not
Right.
like a check off, like
Exactly.
do this.
So you don't get
check
like,
that.
okay, well, yes, was it in Monopoly, collect your $200 and pass go. It's not exactly like that, right? It's a bit more complicated and messy in that way. So building upon this, one of the strategies that I talk about is really reconnecting to or re-engaging with why you actually do the work that you do.
Mm-hmm.
Why you do the work that you do is a source of clarity for many people. It's a source of direction. Many people actually refer to it as the North Star for that reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's something that re-energizes, re-inspires, and motivates you. It's something that helps you to find meaning and grounding in the chaos. It's something that helps you to combat something that I call IDD, or intention deficit disorder, right? Where we're moving through life,
Ooh.
right? Where we're reacting to what's
Intention
happening.
deficit disorder.
Yeah, so intention deficit disorder. So we're reacting to the water holes of things. We're reacting to the news cycle. We're reacting to social media. We're reacting to the things that are happening in our inbox, and we are not
Taking notes.
moving through our days in an intentional way, right? Because we're in reaction mode, right? We're responding to sort of the fires, right? But we aren't necessarily always acting from a place of what's the most meaningful thing that I can be doing right now? What's the most impactful thing that I can be doing? So we might be busy, right? But we're not actually sometimes making impact on the things that really matter. And for some of us in seasons like this, I use the Wizard of Oz as the example. So in the Wizard of Oz, we know that Dorothy gets swept up in a tornado and she gets moved from one place to the other, right? And so for many of us, we feel like we're being swept up in a tornado, right? And we're trying to get our feet on the ground, and we have the uncertainty. We have intention deficit disorder. We have this grief of loved ones and also sort of the non-death losses as well, right? We're overwhelmed by the information and connection to technology and all those things. And that contributes to this idea that we're sort of swept up in this tornado. And so reconnecting to your why can be one of the things that helps to sort of anchor you, right? To sort of bring you back to say, hey, okay, I can see this tornado of things that are swirling around me, but I still remember my North Star. I can still look up in the sky and I can see what direction I need to be moving in. And I can direct the energy that I do have toward that. So I have more that I can say, but I'll pause and see, what thoughts you have about that.
No, I completely agree with that. I love the idea, and I connect with this very well, the intention deficit disorder. So I am creating a series of content and maybe a book all around minimalist marketing. And it's exactly that. We have this shiny object syndrome. We have so much on our plate. We feel like we're constantly reacting, like you said, rather than being proactive and stepping back and thinking, what is our North Star? What are the actions that we're going to take that are going to move the needle the most, or that are going to just make us feel good at the end of the day? I mean, if you're on X all day and it's making you feel horrible, is that the best place for you? Like, how to evaluate, not just based on ROI or KPIs or things like that. It's really about what is our mission and what are our values and how are we aligning everything? And that has just been such a struggle for so many of my clients right now, when it does feel like everywhere we are online, every tool we use, everywhere we shop is just diametrically opposed to what we believe in and what we stand for and what we're fighting for. And
Absolutely.
and I feel that same way.
Yeah.
And it's just incredibly exhausting.
So I will share with you. I'll share with you two power questions because I think for some people this might be a bit abstract,
Okay.
and they may be wondering, well, what if I never had clarity about my why, or what if I'm so clouded by all the stuff that's happening that I can't really think clearly. So can you give me something more concrete? All right.
Yes.
So I have two questions.
Okay.
The first question is, what gifts, talents, or resources do I have to contribute right now? Right. So what do you have right now in terms of gifts, talents, and resources that you can contribute to whatever your work is, or maybe there's an issue in your community that you want to be able to, that your heart is sort of tugging you to do something about. What do you actually have access to contribute to that? Mm-hmm. And then the second is, what or how can I help in a way that energizes me?
Mm.
What or how can I help in a way that energizes me? Not that drains me, not that depletes me, not that makes me feel guilty, but how can I help in a way that actually energizes and fuels me? And I'll give you an example. So during COVID, a lot of groups had to quickly shift from in-person to virtual, right? One of the low-lift things that I was able to do was to actually just lend people access to my Zoom account.
Yes.
I lent access to a book club that I was part of to use and they actually, up until maybe last year, they were still using it, right? There's a mindfulness group for Black men that was meeting in person and had to shift, and the organizer just needed support, right? And so, well, here, use my account. Here's the information. Use it for however long you all need to be able to access it, right?
I love that.
For me, that was a very low lift way to contribute that meant so much to those two groups, right? And it cost me what, like $15 a month for the Zoom account. I'm not using it 24/7 anyway. So why not? Right? And so you can think about right now, starting with sort of the small ways, the small gifts, talents, and resources that you already have, that you can, in ways in which you can support someone. I'm sure that we can all think of things that are low cost or don't cost anything, and don't cost a lot in terms of effort, that would be very meaningful for someone that's actually in need right now.
I was thinking about this the other day, and I was thinking that some days all the energy that I have is just to share on my social media, elevate someone else's content. So someone else that is saying, like Vule or National Council of Nonprofits, or even a nonprofit that's doing fantastic work like rescue.org, the Human Rights Coalition. I frequently share their stories and I share their content on social media because sometimes that is just all that I have energy for.
Yeah.
And I like to do it. I like to elevate their content. So even just something like that, elevating and amplifying a voice that you find powerful. Like, what I feel is that my audience, primarily marketers and fundraisers, they feel like they have to constantly reinvent the wheel, share original content, make original videos, do all the things. And sometimes it's just sharing out what someone else says and maybe adding some context to it.
Absolutely.
Sometimes some of my favorite newsletters are just a list of links, like helpful links. Like, hey, I read this week and it's really cool. And, take a look if you were interested in XYZ.
Absolutely.
So I just wish that more nonprofits would look at the content out there sort of in their industry and cause area. A question that just came to my mind, I don't think I put it on the list, but I know you're going to have a great insight into it. As marketers and fundraisers right now in this moment, how can we effectively mentally and emotionally manage the pushback? So the horrific comments on anything that we post. I mean, I've seen I belong to a bunch of social media manager groups. One for museum social media managers, one for social justice social media managers. And it doesn't seem to matter what your mission is right now. If you're posting and you're putting yourself out there, you're getting negative and maybe hateful comments. You're getting emails responding. You're getting bad email responses or really hateful email responses. How do you suggest that we navigate that because we want to be responsive.
Yes.
I tell my clients, if you send out an email to your 10,000 person email list and you get 2 negative responses back, you got to do the math there.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, someone's reading it, so that's good.
Mm-hmm.
But secondly, let's do the math here. But we always focus on the negative. So how can we get through this time period that's hopefully going to be short-lived?
So this is a powerful question. I think it goes beyond this moment, right? This is just in general. So no matter what you do in life and in work, 100% of people are not going to be behind you.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Even probably 50%.
Right. There are going to be people that don't like the color of your shirt, that don't like the sound of your voice, that don't like the air that you're breathing wherever you are.
And don't like the signs behind you in your office.
Exactly. And so there's nothing that you can do about that. And so what I offer to folks is, number one, remember why you're doing the work, right? Number one. Number two, always remember and center the people who are giving you the love, right? And so for the marketers out there, I know that some of you may be looking at, for example, unsubscribes, right? For example, you could have 10,000 people on your list, but if 2 people unsubscribe from a newsletter that you just sent, like you're fixated on like why those 2 people unsubscribed, right? Yep. But what about like the 9,998 folks that stayed on the list? What about those folks? What about those folks that have opted in and said, you know what, I like what you have to offer. I'm going to open this. I'm going to read this. I'm going to share this. What about those folks, right? So don't fall for the okie doke. Don't fall for the distraction, right? Know that is, I'm going to go back to this circle of life analogy, because I think what some people refer to as your haters, that's also a part of the circle of life.
Yes.
Right? You're not going to always, in all seasons, for all people, be all things. Mm-hmm. That's perfectly okay. The sooner you can accept that, the sooner you can reclaim your energy and repurpose that for your purpose, right? Mm-hmm. The more you're distracted, the more you're giving energy to people that don't appreciate your energy, don't want your energy, right? Are there to cause distortion, distraction, whatever it is. That means that there is time and effort and energy that you're not focusing on what you've been called to do in this season, how you have been called to serve and support and make a difference in this season, right? So remember your North Star, remember your why. Focus on the people that are giving you the love, and just know that the hate that's just part of it, right? That's going to be there. That's not going to go away. Mm-hmm.
Especially if you have something important to say. Mm-hmm. Or if you have anything to say. If you put yourself out there, and I have to remind myself about this all the time. But I feel like I've been pretty polarizing, like I said, since the 90s. Like I've been an outspoken feminist. I've been really clear on what I stand for and my politics and my political views. So if you are watching this right now and you're like, whoa, Julia is like a liberal and you're surprised, I don't know what to tell you. The signs are there. But still, sometimes I do get those emails back. I get social media comments, and it's kind of surprising to me. But it does mean, to me, I take it and I say, that means people are reading or watching or listening. And like you said, that means that all those thousands of people that it resonates with maybe are not saying something. And they do say things often, but to get focused on unsubscribes, it's like that. Yeah. It just means it's not for them. And it just is not for them right now. I unsubscribe from lists and then resubscribe sometimes. So
it's not always personal. Sometimes it's like I like the person, maybe
I switch the job. Maybe,
exactly. Or it's just no longer relevant. I appreciate what you're doing, but it's no longer relevant for me. And I'll share one final example that I often share with folks. You could cure cancer, and there would be people upset that you didn't cure something else.
Oh, 1,000%.
Right?
1,000%.
So keep that in mind as you are thinking about this. This is the pushback, the hate, the resistance, perhaps is more pronounced now in certain ways, but it's not new, and it's part of the work. You can't be a seasoned marketer and communicator and messenger in this work and not have that as part of a skill set that you have, right? Having a thick skin and being able to differentiate, because it's also not personal, because they don't know you, so it can't be personal.
Right.
You have to remind yourself of that. Like they don't really know you, so it can't be personal. So why are you taking it personally?
And I believe that it is the responsibility of nonprofits to talk to their donors and their stakeholders like adults. Like, what's going on right now that I need to know about? Do you know what's happening in the industry, in the cause that I care about? It might be hard to hear. It might not be what I want to hear, but what's going on? How can I help? How can I be a part of it? And I think the problem is that, before COVID, a lot of organizations, if they were not in social justice space, they shied away from talking about current events at all. They would put out their newsletter. It would be 5 events and 3 ways to donate and their volunteer appreciation photos and things like that. But then when COVID hit, they really had to start talking about current events, even if they were polarizing. And I think that holds us back a lot because we don't know how to navigate like the backlash. But bringing it back to like self-care, which is a term that I know is, I'm not sure how I feel about it, or I'm not sure if I really know what it is. I didn't know it looks different for everybody. But I think you talk about one of the biggest barriers to self-care is guilt. So how can we shift our mindset? Well, I guess maybe first of all, how do you define self-care? And how can we start seeing self-care as essential rather than selfish?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess in the broadest sense, self-care is really about how we nourish and resource ourselves, right? So that we can so that we can live our best life, right? And one of the ways I think about this in the context of mission-driven work is we have our outer work, which is sort of the day-to-day of your work, right? So it's the meetings, it's the emails, it's the deliverables that you're producing, it's the work that you're doing out in the community, right? That is the outer work. Many of us are very skilled and very adept at doing that particular form of the work. The inner work is about how we actually resource ourselves. Are you getting enough rest, right? Are you dealing with sort of the mental and emotional state that you're in from moment to moment, right? Are you aware of that? And are you dealing with any challenges that might be arising for you? How connected are you or not to personal and professional mission and vision, right? When we're doing both the inner work and the outer work together, we are engaging in what I would describe as mindful change making. Or another way to think about it is we're managing our well-being while also managing our well-doing, right? We're doing those things simultaneously, right? And so the guilt, the burnout, the overwhelm sometimes is a manifestation of an imbalance between this inner work and the outer work. So for most folks, it's because we're putting so much emphasis on the outer work bucket, not recognizing that we have to be, in order to sustain the outer work bucket, we have to be continuously filling the inner work bucket. One way that I think about this is, when we think about, for folks that are flown frequently, there's the instruction from the flight attendant, right? Which says that in the event of an emergency, an oxygen mask might drop down. The instruction or the invitation is always to secure your own oxygen mask first before you're then able to support someone else, right? And so in that scenario, it's not selfish for you to secure your own oxygen mask first, right? And if we were to extend that further, securing your oxygen mask means getting enough rest. It means practicing good digital hygiene, right? When it comes to what you're consuming and what you're taking in, right? It means how you're taking care of your body, right? terms of food and physical exercise. It means how you're taking care of your spirit, right? How you're renewing your spirit. Are you regularly connecting with folks? Are you taking time to reflect? Do you have a support community, whether that's a therapist or you're part of a spiritual community, like whatever that looks like for you? Are those things that you're doing on a consistent basis that allows you to sort of adjust and readjust and secure that oxygen mask, so that when you then do the outer work of helping other folks secure their oxygen mask, you're able to do that without running out of breath, right? You're able to do that in a sustainable way, as opposed to having what some of us may experience, so that the fall starts, or we sprint for a while and then we get tired and we're out of breath. We got to sit down, or we got to take a day off and come back. When you're doing it in a balanced way, you are able to sustain that outer bucket in a healthier way. So for folks that are struggling with this idea of guilt around this, I offer that framing. I also offer to you that it's not your fault, right? That when we think about self-care, our self-care is not just our responsibility as an individual. It's also the responsibility of the organizations in the communities that we serve, right? So there are institutional and systemic challenges that also contribute to this imbalance between the inner work and the outer work. And so we have to be aware of that. We have to understand what is our sphere of influence as an individual. And we also have to be simultaneous, especially for those of us that are in positions of leadership and influence. We have to be pushing to change the systems and structures inside of our organizations and the sector that contribute to this idea that people feel guilty about taking care of themselves so they can actually do the work for the long term.
It's amazing. It's like this hustle culture, this like crushing it culture. Like I just think, it's like you said, just the intention deficit disorder. We feel like we have to do all the things because we see people do all the things. And once we step back maybe and take a minute to do self-care. I mean, Adrienne says going for a walk or a hike quiets my mind and re-energizes my body. I
Beautiful.
love that. Going for a walk, walking your dog, even going for a drive. I remember in COVID that I would take a walk, but then sometimes I would just take a drive. I just wanted to drive because everyone's in my house, in my face. And I don't have a minute to like listen to my podcast or, do whatever I need to be doing. So sometimes just like taking a drive and listening to an audiobook, I did that quite frequently in COVID. And I think that I still sometimes do that now. Like if I need to go pick up my kid, I leave early and take an extra 10 minutes because I don't know, it's just something that I like to do. Katie says pedicures. Yes, we go get pedicures a lot, or we used to go get pedicures, but pedicures, manicures. Katie, I think you and I would both agree going to Home Goods, even if we just smell the candles, like that's our part
Window
of our
shopping.
self-care. But just whatever makes you happy and re-energizes you. I love that. So for those of us whose jobs, I mean, we're doing this on LinkedIn. We are going to repurpose over the podcast, but for those whose jobs require them to be online and like plugged in all the time, you talk about digital hygiene. What are some practical ways to sort of set boundaries with technology while still really being informed and engaged with the work?
Yeah, so I think this is a very important question. I think especially in this time with the saturation or the oversaturation of information, I think the first places to start is really to identify what I would describe as your trusted messengers, right? Because we don't need to necessarily, from my perspective, be following the play-by-play. Unless you are a first responder, like you don't need to be involved with like sort of the breaking news. There are lots of trusted messengers that we have. Many of us are part of associations, for example. Many of us are members of advocacy organizations whose their job is to follow the play-by-play. Their job is to create a signal from the noise. Their job
I
is
love
to
that.
summarize.
And some of your trusted messengers, that's their job as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So identify your trusted messengers and let those lead for the work related things, let that lead sort of how you're engaging digitally, right? In terms of, in practical terms, I mentioned the associations and the advocacy groups that they are summarizing what's happening. They are identifying practical action items. They're doing some of that coalition building. There's also practical things like, instead of following the play-by-play of the drip-by-drip of sort of the news and things that are coming out, one of the things that I'm a big fan of is listen to the news summary, read the newsletter roundup, right? And with the news summaries, there are podcasts that will do like a 10-15 minute, recap, right? Same thing with the weekly news recap, sort of the highlights of the week. What do you need to know? And that can be a way to sort of balance things, right? Taking that even further, you want to be able to identify some basic boundaries around when and how you're connected to your technology and how you're consuming information, right? What does this mean? Well, it means not grabbing your phone first thing in the morning, right? Do you have a start routine that involves screen-free time that allows you to pour into yourself, put on your oxygen mask first before you then engage in the day? Same thing before you go to bed, right? So having a cutoff time before you go to bed so you can renew yourself, right? Resecure, readjust that oxygen mask before you turn in for the night. Yes. Turning off notifications, especially for things that aren't mission critical. You don't need to know about every single update, like, comment, share on Instagram or TikTok. Like, that's not supporting you personally or professionally in moving your mission forward. And so if that's the case, then you can turn those things off. Maybe there are some instances where maybe you do need to have those alerts turned on, right? Maybe you have the app where you're tracking, where your kid is after school and you need to know where they are. Okay, well, great. You can leave that on, right? But asking yourself the question, does this particular action, does this particular activity, does this particular way in which I'm using my technology or consuming information, is this adding value to my life and work? Or is just taking away value from my life and work, right? Is this energizing me? Is this pouring into me? Is this refueling me? Or is it depleting me? Is it draining me? Is it exhausting me, right? So tapping into that, raising that level of awareness and making those adjustments accordingly. Like, those are very simple things that we can begin to do to make those shifts.
So you gave us some fantastic tips. Are there any personal rituals or practices that you use to stay grounded and sort of emotionally balanced in this work?
Yeah, so I think for me, there are specific practices, but beyond the practices, it's consistency, right? Yeah. Consistency is perhaps the most powerful thing that you can do, right? So if you, going back to the oxygen mask example, if you don't have a process or ritual for consistently sort of readjusting that oxygen mask, right? You're going to have more moments where you're out of breath, right? You're going to have more moments where you're sort of oxygen depleted, if you will. And so for me, consistency is the key. And the key things for me on a daily basis are, physical activity, prayer and meditation, journaling, just sitting in the silence, especially before I go to bed at night, just sort of sitting in the silence and really just taking a moment to just check in with my body, right? What am I releasing from today? What am I allowing in to my life as I move into the next day? And giving myself permission to also what I call right size, meaning there are days when I can do a 25-minute meditation, and that works for me, that works on my schedule, that works on my level of energy and what I have to give, in terms of being present. There's some days where all I can do is a minute, right? And so giving myself permission to check in and say, hey, what do I have the capacity to do based on my energy level, based on my schedule for today? And whether I do a 1-minute reflection or a 25-minute meditation, to give myself credit to say, you know what, you did a great job today.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for showing up for you. I love you, right? If we can all sort of make space for whatever that looks like for us, that 30 seconds, that 5 minutes, that 25 minutes, and you can think about this as sort of a menu of options, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you can proactively identify ahead of time so that you don't have to think about it, right? You already know what the 1 minute version is. For me, like with workouts, for example, I do a lot of YouTube follow along videos, and I have these curated lists of different workout lengths, intensities. And if I only got 5 minutes or 10 minutes, okay, and my intensity level is blah, okay, we're going to do something low intensity. I got 7 minutes. Let me see what we got that fits into that. I do that, and I move on with my day.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely love that. I think that's so important because you can say, I'm going to go to a 45-minute spin class today, but then wake up and you haven't slept and you're tired and your energy level's low. So they're like, what are the other options? Like maybe, like you said, a yoga class on YouTube, or just maybe some light stretching,
Mm-hmm.
or, whatever it is that you feel like you can do today. And then just say, okay, this is fine. This is where I am right now. And just as long as you're doing something to kind of move you along to your goals.
Yeah.
But being really, being cognizant that like you're not going to wake up every day on your A game. Like it's really a struggle for me to not wake up every day on my A+ game. So
Yeah.
I think having to realize your energy levels, what you have the capacity for. It's hard when you go into an office, of course. Like I can pretty much make my own schedule and prioritize my day, but I know it's hard when you have to go physically into an office and someone else is dictating your day. So actually, maybe what are your last question as we kind of wrap up? What are your tips for people that they have to go to, now we're all, there's a big push to go back to work. There's a big push to be in person. There's a big push almost back to those antiquated notions of like the 9 to 7 p.m. and with no breaks. And how do we maintain our sanity and like our self-care in those confines that are maybe designed for burnout?
So I would say, just to pick it up on what we just talked about, right sizing, right? I talked about like picking the length intensity. Like it's more important, especially when you're going to the office and you have less control over your day, to identify what you do have control over. And so for many folks in that scenario, the beginning of your day and the end of your day, you have the most control over. So even if it's 5 minutes on both ends, how are you going to use those bookends? And it's a scientific term that folks refer to as satisficing, right? Or what's good enough for now, right? So sometimes a B is good enough, right? It doesn't have to be A+ every day across the board. Like B is passing, right? So think about what does it look like for you in that context, and in the work, and like during the actual work day, identifying what you actually have the power to control, right? So most people get a lunch break and breaks thereafter. Honoring that, right? Putting it on your calendar, right? Move it around if you need to, but carve it out on your calendar so you have it and you're not trying to fight to reclaim that time after the fact. Thinking about if you have the power to do this, small shifts in terms of shortening the default length of meetings. So for example, a 30-minute meeting becomes 20 or 25 minutes, right? And so with Google Calendar or with Outlook, there's now sort of settings that you can turn on that will automatically shift how meetings are scheduled from the half-hour to hour-long blocks to actually shave off 5 to 10 minutes. So that cumulatively, you have built in more time for transitioning between meetings. And over the course of a day or a week, you've actually reclaimed some of that time that you have for yourself, right? To take a break, to transition, or to maybe do some meaningful work, whatever that is, right? So those are small things that folks can identify that they can focus on. And really the key question to start with, I think, is to really be constantly asking yourself, okay, what do I have the power to control in this situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of the empowering place to start. We can all think about all the things that we don't have in our control. We can all think about all the things that we don't have that we wish we had. But if you ask yourself, okay, I can't control this, I can't control that, but what can I control? And what choice can I make to make things better based on what I can do, and start there.
Oh gosh. And Nautri just wrote, I just had a call with my co-founder, who is also my manager. We talked about the good enough bar and how we align on what that is, so we aren't holding ourselves to a reasonably high bar. Yes. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Because that's
Yeah.
exactly sometimes, what we need to do. I love that. All right. Well, Meico, we're wrapping up. This has been fantastic. So where can people find you, connect with you? I have your website on the screen.
Absolutely.
And where else can people, and tell me, we talked about before we hit record, how you decided to just focus on LinkedIn as opposed to
Yes.
maybe other social media channels. You're streamlining, you're
Yes.
right-sizing.
Right. Exactly. Right. So, mindfultechie.com, mindfultechie.com. Go to the website, join the email list. That is the best way to stay connected and up to date. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. So just search for my name or search for Mindful Techie, and you can find me. And to your point about social media, absolutely asking myself, with the time and resources and effort that I have, where my audience is, where I'm getting the most bang for the buck, if I could only do one thing, if I could only be on one platform, what would it be? And for that reason, I've made LinkedIn my home for this season. I've had an out of office reply set up on X and Facebook for many years now. I haven't actually engaged with either of those platforms in a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
And with Instagram, I pop in occasionally for just getting personal updates, but it's, LinkedIn is where it's at for me right now.
I love it. Okay, well, everyone, I really encourage you to connect with Meico on LinkedIn. Go to the website. Thank you so much for being here today. I know that I needed this conversation, and it looks like in the comments a lot of people did as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, that was